Thank you very much, John. Let me first thank the organizers, thank George, Robert, everybody for the opportunity to be here. It's also a pleasure to share the podium with Tommaso, who is an old colleague and friend, and we have gone through many discussions together through the years. Let me take this opportunity. By the way, it's 6 after 10, Tommaso, and the program was supposed to finish at 10 o'clock, so we are already 6 minutes late. So I'm going to try to just lay out a few thoughts on the global crisis and some of the lessons that we have learned from it, and conclude with the urgent need for more and better international cooperation. I was sitting next to Joe Stiglitz at dinner, and we were remembering some of the many crises that have taken place in emerging markets. For me, of course, the Mexican crisis, the tequila crisis of 95, 94, and this recent episode have been the most challenging of my career. And I do find striking similarities between the origins of the Mexican crisis and other emerging market crises, as documented recently by Rogoff and Reinhardt, and those of the 2007-2009 global financial crisis. Hefty macroeconomic imbalances, large capital inflows fostered partly by an increase in risk appetite in an environment of low international interest rates, excessive credit growth spurred by large capital inflows prior to the crisis, serious deficiencies in banking practices in a number of areas, lack of transparency, distorted incentives that favored excessive risk-taking by financial institutions, major shortcomings in the framework of financial regulation and supervision, and a crisis characterized by liquidity, solvency, and systemic problems. However, the consequences have been very different. We in the emerging markets, when we have a crisis, we have mostly the power to hurt ourselves. And we probably spread contagion to a few other countries. But this one was, of course, the mother of all financial crises. The epicenter was in the major financial center in the world. And what is really appalling is first the simultaneity after the Lehman, the Lehman crash, the transmission mechanism between the freezing of the financial sector and the consequences to the real sector, the fall in exports, was simultaneous across the globe, and it was measured almost in real time. This is something that we have never experienced before. Now, in the initial stages, the response to the crisis was based largely on ad hoc measures, not always consistent. And one has to ask why. And in my view, there are several explanations. First is that I think that the authorities took a while to understand what was going on. If you read Mr. Paulson's book, he goes into a very detailed analysis of everything that was happening prior to the crisis. And then he concludes that they didn't really know what was going on until many months after the crisis erupted. Second, of course, the belief that market forces combined with what was supposed to be market discipline and supervisory frameworks would enough to reasonably protect the financial system. And the third element was mentioned by Dominique this morning, and that was complacency. The financial sector resisted many shocks. So yes, he named them. So I think that there was a sense of great complacency. It was only after the collapse of Lehman that it became clear that a forceful and coordinated response was needed. And then is when the coordination mechanisms at the level of G20 were implemented. Now let me talk a little bit about what's being done in terms of, or is being done, proposed in terms of regulation. First, and I would say that the proposals have been at two levels. One, a more technical one, which is being worked on the Basel Committee and then, at the Financial Stability Board, and it's focusing mostly on capital requirements, liquidity, buffers, but also in clearing systems for derivatives, compensation, and so on. This is more or less the technical part. And then you have national initiatives. The Volcker Plan on the one hand, the Tobin tax that's coming out of Europe, and so on. And the idea would be to converge all these initiatives at the level of the FSB and the G20. But let me tell you that I'm pretty skeptical, on several grounds. First, I think that even at the technical level, you can see that there are huge differences of opinion between the different national governments depending on the state of the banking system. So calibrating the definitions of capital, and by the way, this is something that nobody knows exactly what the numbers are, and there are no models and there's no scientific method to go about it, is going to be an extremely difficult exercise. Even just getting to the definition of what really Tier 1 means is going to take quite a bit of effort. So the timetable that has been stated, which is to calibrate this in 2010 and put them into effect in 2011, I think it's extremely ambitious. The other aspect that bothers me, of course, is that many of these initiatives are geared towards problems that were originated, of course, in the major financial centers, and there is very little regard for the consequences on emerging markets. And let me just give you a very quick example or two. The ban on banks' activities, for example, proprietary trading. It's very difficult to distinguish between market-making activities and proprietary trading, particularly in emerging markets. And particularly in emerging markets that have opened their financial systems and have a large presence of foreign subsidiaries. If this came into effect, that would mean, of course, that the liquidity in many of the emerging markets would dry, and that would be certainly an undesirable consequence. You see, we always thought in the emerging market world that the most likely scenario was that the subsidiaries would get in trouble, and the question was whether there was any responsibility on the part of the parent bank to rescue the subsidiaries. Well, the world turned upside down. In Latin America and in Asia, the countries that had suffered financial crisis in the 90s and early 2000s, none of these countries suffered a financial crisis as a consequence of the global crisis. That means that we did learn from our experience, from our mistakes. And if you look across the Western Hemisphere, all Latin American banks, both local banks and subsidiaries of foreign banks, are in much better shape and much better capitalized than the parent banks. So we have to think differently in terms of the game going forward. Unless we have a global regulator, a global lender of last resort, and a global taxpayer, the regulations, they have to be maintained at the local level. Because there will be no transfer from a levy on the banking system from the financial centers to the periphery. Okay? So I think that this is the point that I was trying to drive at. Let me go quickly to a couple of other points. One is the question of the stimulus, the withdrawal of the stimulus, both on the fiscal and monetary side. I think this is the big question going forward in terms of assuring sustainability in the global economy. Dominique mentioned this morning that the IMF is projecting on average for the G3, that's the US, Japan, and Europe, plus the UK, to get to debt to GDP levels of about 115% of GDP by 2014. That is 40 points above the pre-crisis levels. Never since World War II has debt increased so fast. And this is already being manifested, of course, in sovereign concerns. And Greece is a case in point. I'm not going to talk about Greece because I don't know if Tommaso will touch upon it. But if I have learned anything about crisis and crisis management, is that you have to restore confidence immediately. And that requires, well, both adjustment and finance, and you probably want to overshoot on both counts. But I mean, what has happened in Europe in the past few weeks in terms of the financing arrangements that are being proposed for Greece is exactly the wrong way to go about it. That is, if you want to provoke additional uncertainty and additional doubts on debt sustainability, that is the way to go. I hope that they do rectify that. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that the fiscal challenge, mostly in the advanced economies, is the most serious threat posed to global economic stability and prosperity in the coming years. Turning to monetary policy, monetary authorities responded to the problems in the financial sector with the forceful implementation of a number of extraordinary measures, and we all know about that. Some of these extraordinary measures are being withdrawn. The balance sheets are beginning to contract. But it is my feeling, of course, that having put so much money on the table, the governments of the large governments, interest rates will remain low for a very extended period of time, which is, in my view, what should be done. But that brings other problems, and that brings particularly acute problems for emerging markets. And we are seeing that already. I mean, the carry trade is in full blast. All the risk measures, the risk appetite measures have gone up. And emerging markets are fighting currency appreciation, assets, in general, asset appreciation. You have places in Asia, from Singapore, China, and some cities in China and so on, where property prices have increased very, very sharply. So we have seen this picture before. We have seen this movie before several times, And once the US and Europe start normalizing rates, you're going to see a reversal of these flows and increased volatility. So I think that this is something that we have to be aware. And emerging markets are choosing to self-insure. What does that mean? That if before the crisis emerging markets were accumulating international reserves at a fast pace, they will do it even faster now. And then we go to the Triffin dilemma that Tommaso just wrote a paper about. Let me conclude by talking a little bit about international cooperation. I think that what was done, and I think that Dominique also touched upon it this morning, in October of 2008 was also totally unprecedented. I mean, we had an emergency G20 meeting in Washington, and I have never seen the hearts and minds of ministers and governors, tune up to the same goal. Of course, we were very close to the precipice. Now, the point is whether now that the emergency has passed, we have the framework to work in the very causes, for example, global imbalances and so on and so forth, these regulation issues that I talked about that were an ingredient in causing the crisis in the first place. And then again, I am a little bit skeptical on that. The plan for the G20, of course, this year is to ask each country to submit a 5-year economic program stating the goals, stating the numbers, etc. And then the IMF is going to put all this together and signal out the inconsistencies, the global inconsistencies and the spillovers. Well, I hope this works, but we have seen this before. I remember at the IMFC meeting in 2006, there was also an initiative of multilateral surveillance, which consisted basically on the same elements, and it did not work. So the current crisis has demonstrated both the need to tailor measures to the circumstances of the countries and the need to prevent actions that have adverse spillover on other countries. Industrial countries need to do much more to get their own houses in order than the emerging markets. And similarly, exit strategies will need to be framed in light of each country's circumstances. But there is a risk that countries will consciously or unconsciously take steps that have adverse effect on their neighbors. It's difficult to square the circle. The framework exercise might help, but past experience shows that we don't have a lot of grounds for optimism. The fundamental problem is reconciling self-interested actions with the greater good of the wider community. More or less, and moreover, effort of the international cooperation should go beyond the realm of the G20. So it's fundamental to ensure an adequate functioning of the existing pillars of international cooperation, the IMF, the BIS, and their coordination with other bodies such as the Financial Stability Board. Let me try to conclude on a positive note and see if, as it was mentioned again this morning by Dominique, the need for the G20 to be an operative body, the need to consolidate its leading role replacing the G7, calls for results, okay, and calls for concrete actions. So that is the hope that we have, that we can correct some of the distortions that caused this crisis in the first place. Thank you very much.